Hey there, guys. Welcome back. We do have 10 minutes or so until we start. But good to be with you, and hope you're having a great one so far. Just hang in there. I'm just, setting up the live stream a little bit early, as I always do, and hanging out with Eddie for the moment. Hey, Eddie. Hey, Santino and Jemin. Good to see both of you guys. Peachy. Here's Peachy. This is the sister. Eddie's the brother, so two kitties. She's a little smaller. Different markings and stuff. Good girl. It's Peachy, yeah. Princess Peach. How's it going, Peachy? Yeah, she's making an appearance. What's up, Peachy? So yeah, just another 7.5 minutes, and then we'll really get going. Peachy. What is it, Peachy? Hmm? Just kind of like walking around down there. So. Hey, Elena. Welcome back, and good to see you too. Just another 6 minutes, basically, till 4 o'clock. So just hang tight for a few moments, and we'll get going. Are you required to have quotes? I mean, it's not like it won't receive a grade with no quotes, but quotes are good. They show engagement with the text, so it's definitely advised. It's encouraged. It's not like an absolute requirement, but uh, I was hoping that you might integrate a couple, basically. Yeah. Hey, Jennifer, welcome back. No worries. Thank you for the question. Just 4 minutes, and then we'll all get started. They were jumping around a minute ago. If you ever watch the replay, you'll see that Eddie was there at the beginning, and then Peachy kind of appeared for a bit. But now they're running along doing their own thing. So we'll see if they come back. Hopefully they don't misbehave, get into any little squabbles. I don't want to have to get up and break it up, but we'll see. No, it's not the absolute maximum. I mentioned this previously that it's fine to go beyond 4 pages, not to worry at all. So if you need more than 4, just feel free to keep going. That's totally fine. Thanks, Jasmine. Hey, Leanne. Hello. Oh, yeah, no worries. That's good. Thanks for the question. And 3 minutes. Hey there. How's it going? Golden RB. You deleted your message? Why? Hey, Anthony. Good to see you. Hello? Question mark? Yeah, must have been a typo, but it's good to see you. Couple minutes, 2 minutes. Hey, Karen. Okay, we're getting close. Just another minute, everybody. Thanks for your patience there. If you've been hanging in here in the live chat, just waiting. But good to be with you guys. Hey, Tyler. Mary Jane, hey there. Welcome back. Poria, good to see you too. Hey, Natalie and Jasmine. Welcome back to you guys too. Rosemary, Jean. Okay, guys. Well, we're pretty much at 4 p.m., so I'm going to go ahead and let things get started now. Welcome back, and good to see everyone here in the chat. Hey, Jerome, and all the rest. Appreciate you guys attending and making the discussions good. So just keep one thing in mind. I'm sure you haven't forgotten, but just to remind you, you do have your first essay assignment due today. So you're just going to email me that before 11:59 p.m. tonight. Anytime when you're ready with it. Some people have sent theirs in already. Others, I'm still waiting on them, but definitely it is due today. So do your best. Yeah, not to worry, Bijan. You know, you always have the opportunity to watch the replay later, but if you have any kind of technical issues, the video is not going nowhere, so you'll definitely be able to watch it one way or the other. But hopefully your Wi-Fi connection kind of improves. But yeah, so just saying again, don't forget to send in those essays by the end of the day. They're due today. I also mailed out the study guide. Can anybody confirm that they saw the posted announcement on Canvas? Let me know if you can. And that's just your study guide. You're going to be using that to prepare for the test. The test is in 2 weeks. It'll be Thursday in 2 weeks from now. And we will also have a little review session on the, did I say Tuesday? Thursday. It's a Thursday 2 weeks from now. And we'll have a review session on the class period before that. So just keep that in mind. Next thing that we're looking forward to. With the essays, I'll be grading them all this weekend and into next week. And everyone that submitted their essay will be receiving an email from me by the end of next week with their score and with their comments. So you'll get your grade and comments by the end of next week. And then, you know, we're of course building towards the midterm test. But we do have 3 more lessons, 3 more lecture periods before we do the review session and the exam. You're asking, is it first come, first serve? I'm sorry if I'm maybe not fully understanding. Is what first come, first serve? Grading. Oh, no, it's not that way. I mean, no, you'll all just probably get the same. You'll get the response when they're all done. So, no, it's not that way. I'll do all of them, and then I'll email everybody at the same time. So it doesn't matter if you turned it in yesterday or if you turn it in at 11:59 p.m. tonight. You're basically going to get a response from me on the same day next week. But anyway, not to worry. Like I say, I have a self-imposed deadline, so you'll get your comments back by the end of the following week. Okay, so let's just kind of make sure that we're following what we've done. We're finishing today the topic of the drug debate and drug policy, recreational use, legalization, prohibition, and all that stuff. Last time we got through most all of the topic of Douglas Husak's article, A Moral Right to Use Drugs. And just kind of summarizing and recapping some of the basic points that he made. He talks about how there's a lot of problems with drug policy, that there's a lot of people arrested each year for minor infractions, just possession or use, often of marijuana. He talks about how that really clogs our court system, overcrowds our prison system, that it costs a significant amount of money to the taxpayer to fund the enforcement efforts and the incarceration and the funding of court-appointed legal counsel for people. But he thinks that, you know, even if you were to set aside the cost benefit, which he thinks weighs more heavily on the side of legalizing things, that people should have a moral right to use drugs as long as what they're doing is simply self-regarding behavior, that we should be granted the liberty to do those things as long as it doesn't interfere with other people. He doesn't like the war on drugs metaphor, the military metaphor of war on drugs. He thinks that's problematic for a number of reasons. It kind of makes us think in all or nothing terms, victory or defeat. It makes us think that some of our fellow citizens are to be equated with enemies, and as you would think in terms of a war. He says that the metaphor has not been consistently applied because there are many other social problems that we don't call we don't say we're fighting a war against. And he thinks it also can be linked to antagonism against foreigners because we sort of use them as a scapegoat for drug availability. He also thinks that much drug use that people engage in recreationally is responsible and moderate, and therefore too much is made of the exceptional case of the most extreme drug addicts on some of the most hardcore narcotic drugs. If we have a right to do something, rights take precedence over utility. So he thinks that we have a right, notwithstanding the utilitarian argument that he also thinks favors legalization. He talked then a little bit about how there is also maybe perhaps not even-handed application of these laws, that they may be punishments handed out on a sort of discriminatory basis because it seems like minorities absorb more of the legal costs of the drug laws, even though they're not the majority of users. Um, he thinks that there are principles of criminalization. The only one that can really, in his view, be justifiable is the harm principle of criminalization, because clearly we have no right to harm other people. But he denies the paternalism principle of criminalization, and he also thinks that the legal moralism principle is problematic and troubling, because it would seem as though we're supposed to enshrine some view of morality in the law at the expense of others, even if we didn't think that the underlying conduct was itself harmful. At the root of it, he thinks that there's a sort of Christian conception of virtue that's driving this moral perspective that drug use is wrong, because it does involve a recreational pleasure seeking through the alteration of consciousness. He finds it strange that people target the alteration of consciousness for these penalties, because it's not really targeted in other contexts where people do self-regarding behavior that just changes their consciousness, whether that's meditation or like runner's high or things of that nature. And he thinks that to kind of enforce a Christian conception of morality in the law is not really the business of the law, that the law should more minimally have the task of keeping us safe from one another and from harm from other people, not trying to stand up some idea of non-altruistic behavior is wrong because it doesn't imitate the example of Christ. At the very end, and this is the one thing that I had left over from last time, I think I was telling you guys that Husak's last word is that he wants to be understood as having this view that just because he believes that we should have the right to do something, he's not necessarily encouraging us to do that thing. So I'm going to put that in the chat really quick and expand on his point. And this is going to kind of wrap up our notes on Douglas Husak's article. So having a right to X, or saying that people should have a right to X, so I put that in the chat, and this is his claim that I want to explain in more detail. He says, just because someone argues that we may have a right to do something, it's not the same as encouraging people to do it. So as much as he's arguing that there is a right to use these drugs recreationally, he doesn't want to be confused as having said, I'm encouraging people to use drugs. You kind of know what he means? Like, just because you think someone has the right to do something doesn't mean that you're advising them to do it. Or so it's just because he thinks we have a right to do drugs, it's not like he's pro-drug use or that he's encouraging people, go ahead and use drugs as much as possible. It's fully consistent to say that people can have a right to something and you don't even encourage it. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but let's follow it up with an example. Let me ask you this simple enough question. Would you agree that you have a right to drop out of school? That's probably an easy question, but let's just get into it. Yeah, surely you do. I mean, it's your life. It's your decision. If you want to continue with school, that's great. But at the end of the day, you have the right to discontinue your studies. So do you not want to take this midterm? This could be your maybe last lecture you ever watched. You can decide right after this that you're done and you don't want to finish school. Now, at the same time, even if you have the right not to finish school, I'm not telling you that you should not finish school. So there's two different things here. One is you have the right to make a choice for yourself, but I'm not necessarily advising you or encouraging you to take that action. There are a lot of things that you have the right to do, and I wouldn't deny that you have the right to do them, but I don't think they are a very good idea. Like, for example, I'm a big believer in education. I'm standing here as, your professor, so I went all the way through school. But I don't deny that you have the right to stop if you want. I mean, it's obviously your discretion and it's your prerogative. There are other things you have a right to do that I don't think I necessarily have any advice for you to do them. You have a right to change your religion to another one. You have your right to, but I'm not necessarily advising that you do that either. You have the right to go to school wearing a neon yellow chicken suit. But I think that would be a pretty awkward fashion choice. So I'm not advising you to do that. It's not encouragement, but I don't think that there's anything I can say against your right to do it. So he wants his view to be understood in that context. Though he's made a very detailed argument that we have a right to use these drugs, he's not trying to say, and you should do them, and it's a good idea for you to do them. You have the right to do all kinds of things that are probably not so well advised. You have the right to not sleep tonight or tomorrow if you really don't want to, but I think it would probably be not so great for your sleep rhythms or for your overall health. So just having the right to do something is not the same as being advised in terms of doing that thing. At the very end, he kind of tries to couch his view in the language of pro-choice, which is interesting because it connects to our previous topic. He wants to be known as having a pro-choice position on the issue of drugs. So So why does he use the terminology pro-choice? Because to be pro-choice just means that you believe in someone's right to decide something, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're advising them to make a specific choice. You could be pro-choice in the abortion debate, and you might think that you're not necessarily arguing in favor of any particular person getting an abortion. You just believe that they should have the right to choose whether or not they want to. So in the same way, he's like, I believe people should have the freedom to make their own private decisions about recreational drug use, but it's not that I'm telling anyone that that's the good idea or that that's a choice that I'm urging them to make. It's just that I think that they should have the freedom to decide. I'll read his words on that, and then we'll be good to go, and we can move on to the author for today. Here's how he says it at the end. He says, first, the conclusion that adults have a moral right to use drugs recreationally does not mean I'm advocating drug use. The distinction between encouraging conduct and conceding that adults have a right to engage in that conduct might seem too obvious to state, except that many prohibitionists about drugs have failed to recognize this. This basic distinction is widely appreciated in many other contexts. Adults have the moral right to preach communism or to practice Buddhism, yet no one who defends this right would be misunderstood to recommend a conversion to those things. Nonetheless, one of the most widely voiced objections to the proposal to repeal laws against drugs is that it would express the wrong symbolism about drug use, especially among adolescents. I go down a little farther, and then he says, in order to dispel the impression that support for a right to use drugs is equivalent to encouraging drug use, those who reject laws against drugs should be described as endorsing a pro-choice position on recreational drug use. And then he says, this label has been carefully crafted by people who uphold the right of women to terminate their pregnancies. These persons are not pro-death or anti-life, as their critics would like the public to believe. Perhaps many of them would not choose abortion as their own solution to an unwanted pregnancy. Still, they believe that women have the right to make this choice for themselves. Misunderstanding would be avoided if the debate about the decriminalization of recreational drug use borrowed this terminology. The conclusion that adults have a moral right to use drugs recreationally should be described as a pro-choice position on recreational drug use. And at the very end, he says, with our anti-drug education efforts, he believes that we can learn something from sex education efforts, because the most effective sex education is not like abstinence-only messaging, like just don't have sex. Oftentimes they will talk to you about how to do so responsibly, to protect yourself, or to use the proper kind of contraceptive methods. So an important part of sex education is recognizing that some people inevitably will make the choice to have, like, say, premarital sex, and if they do, they should be told how to do that without like endangering themselves or other people. So he thinks that the same kind of lesson can be applied to anti-drug education efforts. It's not realistic, perhaps, to expect everybody to abstain from drugs, but on the same token, he thinks that they could be told about how to use drugs moderately or within reason. More attention, he thinks, should be paid to the example of the moderate recreational drug user that consumes it within responsible limits, because that's really not an element of most anti-drug education. It's usually just say no and use the broken record method, just keep saying no. But he thinks that abstinence-only education isn't really very effective in the sexual case, and so he thinks the same kind of lesson might be, helpfully applied to the whole anti-drug education messaging too, which is what he says here. Drug education, let me see. No existing educational program has attempted to either separate use from abuse or to indicate how abuse might be avoided by means other than abstinence. The introduction of scientifically respectable materials in drug education programs has been politically unacceptable. Since I make no attempt to solve America's drug problem as a matter of social policy, I will hazard only one final observation about the prospects for success that drug education, as so conceived, will minimize drug abuse. To demand that recreational drug users show restraint over the time, place, and quantity of their consumption is not to require the impossible. In fact, virtually every drug user exhibits some degree of control over her consumption. The means by which users manage to avoid abuse deserve careful study and extensive publicity. Perhaps a successful educational program should seek out responsible drug users. In no other scenario is experience perceived as a liability, unless the experience was so devastating to the educator that he now appreciates the folly of his drug use and counsels total abstinence. Still, informal cultural controls over the use of the most dangerous drugs do not emerge quickly. To respect the moral right of adults to use recreational drugs may be painful, at least in the short run, but the protection of moral rights has a value to Americans that is not easily expressed in the utilitarian calculus of cost and benefit. So that's, the end, I guess, of the Husak article. Just had some loose ends to wrap up with him. But we move on now to the next and the last author on this whole topic. So this final author on the drug unit is Gerald Dworkin. And his article is called, if I can spell it without making it illegible, it's called Paternalism. And this is a paper that he wrote back in 1972. So, Gerald Dworkin, Paternalism from 1972. Okay. So, he calls our attention to some ideas of John Stuart Mill. But first off, let me just give you the overall, I guess, summary of what he's going to say. He talks about paternalism, and as we've talked about it earlier in our semester, paternalism is the idea of limiting the liberty of a person in order to prevent them from causing self-harm. So it's an interference in the liberty of a person, which is intended to promote their own well-being. Like, for example, parents that restrict the outright freedom of their children to do what they want because they think that they may make unwise or immature decisions. This can also be seen as something that can be done with the law, as the state now acts as the paternalistic figure, restricting some measure of individual liberties in order to supposedly protect people from self-harm. He explores the question of paternalism and when it's justified. And he'll ultimately come to the conclusion that there is at least some justification for paternalistic interference, and that might, in his view, also cover the case of these anti-drug laws, which are, to many people, paternalistic in nature. He begins his paper by making a reference to some perhaps neglected quotes of John Stuart Mill. So we studied John Stuart Mill on the topic of utilitarianism right at the beginning of the semester. He's the guy that said that you should follow the utilitarian ethical system, which says to do whatever creates the most happiness for the greatest number of people. But in general, Mill is thought of as like a classic anti-paternalist. He wrote this whole book called On Liberty, and the main point of it is that we should grant individuals the maximum liberty, which is consistent with maintaining social order. So as long as what a person does is self-regarding behavior that doesn't encroach on other people's well-being, then Mill would have thought they should be free to do that. So Mill is like a famous example of an anti-paternalist writer. He argues that if people wanted to drink alcohol, see a prostitute, gamble, that they should be permitted to do those things because at the end of the day, those are actions that don't affect negatively other people besides the individual doing it. But he has this one quote that Dworkin calls our mind or attention to. And in this quote, Mill says that there's at least one self-regarding action that even he would say that we should not permit people to do. He gives the example of choosing to become a slave. And I'll read the quote here. So, but before I read it here, let me explain. Mill says that even if a person wanted to do it, for whatever reason, they should not be allowed to choose to become enslaved. They should not be allowed to choose slavery for themselves. And why do you think he would say that? You know, like if he's such a big anti-paternalist, if he's such a strong libertarian, then why do you think he says that, you know, if I want to do it and it's just up to me, I want to be a slave? Why do you think he would say that we shouldn't be allowed to do that? And I'll give you a hint. It has to do with how much value he places on liberty. So any thoughts? Why do you think the classic libertarian that says do whatever you want as long as it doesn't interfere with other people would stop short of allowing people to actually like choose to willfully become a slave? Because if they did do that, then what? Anything you have on your side? Well, you give the example of addiction, yes. And I see how you're applying the question of slavery to addiction, but we're talking about like literal slavery, like becoming a person that's placed into servitude and bondage without compensation, like the slavery era. It's the ultimate removal of personal freedom, Tyler. Yes, that's correct. Correct, yeah. So what he's saying is he believes in liberty. He doesn't want people's liberty to be trampled on, like don't tread on me type of idea, right? But at the same time, he says we shouldn't grant people the freedom to relinquish their freedom because that would be kind of like logically contradictory or inconsistent. Imagine a person saying, you know, I want to be free to be a slave. I want to have the freedom to choose to be a slave. If you became a slave, then of course you would eliminate and completely destroy all of your freedom going forward. So he thinks that even though he is opposed to paternalism and supportive of libertarian thought, he believes that no one should be free to be a slave. So let me put that in the chat and I'll read some quotes, but here's what Mill said. So I just put there, even though Mill is a classic libertarian and he opposes paternalism, he does think that we should not give people the freedom to choose to be a slave, because again, that would not be in the interests of your liberty, all things considered. And now I'm reading a quote from Mill. Mill said, the principle of freedom cannot require that the willing slave should be free not to be free. It is not freedom to be allowed to alienate your freedom. So what Dworkin's strategy is in this paper, kind of using Mill as his intellectual source of support, he believes that based on this quotation of Mill that even a strong libertarian would agree with, that we shouldn't be allowed to be choosing slavery. And if that's the case, he thinks that that kind of concept can be used to expand the sphere of justified paternalistic interference just a little bit more broadly to encompass the anti-drug laws. So it's kind of like, in his view, the argument in favor of some limited range of justified paternalism gains strength when you can recruit the ideas of Mill to support that idea, because Mill, again, is classically associated with and historically associated with arguments against paternalism. You know, he's normally associated with the idea that we should give people maximum freedom consistent with social order. So if even Mill would be a person that would be willing to say, you know, we can interfere with your freedom if you're going to do something tantamount to enslaving yourself, and then Dworkin tries to use that to apply to the drug issue, then he thinks there'd be a really good, strong, robust intellectual argument for at least some limited forms of paternalism, because he thinks that like even a guy like Mill, who's known for not supporting paternalism at all, would have been at least to this extent supportive, because he did make this statement that people should not be allowed to choose slavery for themselves. So Mill gives us this kind of classic anti-paternalist argument. He says that the state may only limit a person's freedom to prevent harm to others, not to oneself. And he justifies that idea based on his utilitarian ethical framework. He says that people will have more general overall happiness when we tolerate them to do as they see fit, as long as it doesn't interfere with other people. And some people will ground the decriminalization arguments on that. They would say that society is overall happier, even taking into account whatever loss of utility granting people the liberty to do drugs involves. It's going to be outweighed by the benefits in terms of overall happiness from people having their liberty. On the other hand, some will use utilitarian arguments to justify paternalism and criminalization. They will say that restricting people's liberty, at least in some range, would actually lead to the greater overall happiness for society. So utilitarians are actually capable of going either way on this issue, but Mill, the kind of classic utilitarian, does think that utilitarianism has a little bit of greater favor for anti-paternalism in general. The advocate of decriminalization thinks that when you look at the empirical facts, they'll show that the health hazards of drug use are exaggerated, and that too much generalization is being done from the marginal case of heavy users or heavy addicts. They also point out a double standard with respect to other recreational activities. As they mention on page 241 of our textbook, no other recreational activity is singled out for severe punishment because of its risks to health. The only conceivable basis for treating illicit drugs differently from other recreational activities is that the former are more risky by a substantial degree than the latter. But illicit drug use is not more risky than any number of these behaviors. You know, we'll allow people to free climb on the side of a mountain with no ropes just for fun because they find it exhilarating. And of course, they could die at any moment by doing that. Or we allow people to, you know, race around on ATVs without, you know, restraint, or, you know, there's all kinds of activities, sporting activities, recreational activities that pose certain threats to your well-being and safety, but we don't restrict those. So some people might argue that there's also this inconsistent standard when it comes to the way that we limit and prohibit drug use or recreational drug use. some paternalism arguments in favor of paternalism will make appeal to the concept of autonomy. And we may have talked about autonomy in previous meetings, but I want to make sure that it's clearly defined now, so I'm going to put it in our chat. Autonomy, it's individual self-determination, free of outside control. That's autonomy. The full word autonomy derives from some root words. Auto meaning self, and nomi comes from the Greek word nomos, which means law. So an autonomous thing is something that is a self-lawgiver. It's something that gives its own rules to itself, and these rules are not imposed by something outside of it. So when you have autonomy, you have individual self-determination. You're free to do as you want without external factors controlling your decision. You have more autonomy when you have more individual freedom. So like when you were a little child and your parents decided what you would eat, what you would wear, what you would do that day, when you would go to bed, you didn't have as much autonomy, let's suppose, as you have now as an adult, because those like limitations are being removed from you because now we think you're just mature enough to make your own decisions. So autonomy is greatly valued by all people. You know, we want to be free. We don't want to be having other people run our lives for us. But there are arguments that are given by both the anti-drug advocate and the advocate of decriminalization that both make an appeal to the concept of autonomy. So autonomy has been used in both pro and anti-drug arguments. Let's see if you guys can figure out how that might be. If a person was, standing on the principle that we should have autonomy and that autonomy is important, if this person was opposed to the drug laws, this is perhaps the easier side of the argument to understand. Suppose someone is opposed to drug laws. They believe that we should decriminalize. If they are saying that because of the value of autonomy, then what do you think their overall argument would kind of imply? So how can a pro-legalization argument be linked to some claims about how important autonomy is? How can valuing autonomy be supportive of a legalization, pro-legalization viewpoint? Why? It's easy to say, I think, but I just figure someone here in the chat will let us know. So again, assuming that a person believes that we should legalize these recreational drugs, and they're saying that because of something having to do with autonomy, what is their argument going to basically kind of look like in general? Why should we legalize the drugs? According to this view that autonomy matters and it's very precious to us? Tell me if you can. You should be free to make your own choices without government interference. Right. So some people might say that if I'm prohibited from making personal decisions about whether to use these drugs, that's getting in the way of my individual freedom and liberty. And as Mary Jane also says, you are given the individual self-determination free of external control because you have the choice to. Yes, with respect to the drug issue, some people may say that when there are these laws imposing on me, prohibiting me from doing certain things that I may want to do for my own reasons, that is a violation of my autonomy and that my autonomy would be promoted if these restrictions were removed. But on the other hand, some people that are in favor of criminalization will also make reference to autonomy. And they say that we are the true defenders of your autonomy by imposing these laws on you. Now, this may be the harder side of the two-way argument to fully formulate, but let me see if anyone thinks they might be able to tell me what that's all about. Like, how do you think someone might be able to appeal to the value of autonomy when they're making an anti-drug argument or a pro-criminalization argument? How can it be that that is serviceable to the end of safeguarding your autonomy by actually having these criminal restrictions in place? How could that be something that supports autonomy, perhaps? Because some people will argue this way. And Dworkin, in a way, kind of does. So he's trying to say, look, everyone cares about autonomy, but it's not just decriminalization that promotes that. It could be criminalization that indirectly is, even more of a safeguard to your autonomy. But let's see if anyone has thoughts about that. How could making drugs illegal protect autonomy? Just giving you a second to think. I know it takes a moment to type. and there's sometimes a little lag between when I say something and when it comes through on your end. Okay, Bijan, you say you have a choice to not do the drugs or go to jail. That is one argument I've heard. This is not it, though. That's not actually a choice. That's coercion. I mean, going to jail is not something that somebody wants. So you don't choose to go to jail. You're punished by the law. So it's not really like the same thing as autonomy. Poria, would drugs be considered external control? There you go. That's getting closer to it. So some may argue that when you become a drug user and say these drugs were illegal, say that the recreational drugs, you could go out and just buy them and there would be no fear of legal penalties. Under those conditions, some argue that people would then use them in greater numbers and more people would become addicted to drugs. And in some people's view, if you became addicted to drugs, it would be the drug that would then take away your ability to make rational individual decisions, because the addiction, so to speak, would be choosing things for you. So have you ever kind of thought about that? Like a person that's strongly addicted to drugs may not be able to choose to stop doing them. They may not be able to choose to refrain from actions that are intended towards the outcome of getting the drug and using it again. So some people think that your autonomy is compromised by addiction, because once you become addicted, yes, people do drink alcohol. That is also a drug. Yeah, that's correct. But I'm not sure to what point you make that statement. People do drink alcohol. Yes, it's a drug, but we're talking about the currently prohibited substances that are used recreationally, like marijuana, cocaine, crack, heroin, ecstasy, etc. So the claim that one might make to justify criminalization on the basis of valuing autonomy is that by permitting people to use the drugs, that could actually compromise their autonomy, since they would become addicted. And then when you're under the influence of an addiction, you might not be able to make free choices anymore. The drug would compel you to do things that you wouldn't do if you were fully rational and completely independent. So what I'm trying to point out is that two sides of the argument, anti-drug, pro-drug, they can both make the claim that they're the true defenders of your autonomy. The pro-drug argument would be, in a simple, straightforward way, we should be giving people the freedom to make choices whether to use the drugs. The anti-drug argument would be that, well, if we gave people that freedom, it would have a larger cost to their autonomy down the line for many people anyway, because if they became addicted to those substances, that would curtail or limit their ability to make free decisions without the drug imposing an influence over their judgment and decision-making. And Mary Jane, you say the purchasing of drugs have to go to some sort of economy that could affect their autonomy depending on where the money goes. Well, I don't know. I mean, it's speculative, I suppose, what kind of economic outcome it would be. Some people think that it would go back into taxpayer funding of public programs and agencies. Other people think that it might be used to help promote anti-drug education efforts. So that would be just a policy choice. There's nothing, I think, conceptual I can say about it, but it's still a worthwhile factor to consider as well. So anyway, I'm just taking you through some of the thoughts of Dworkin here. Autonomy has been used in both pro and con drug arguments. Advocates of decriminalization say that drug laws attack your autonomy and they're an unjustified restriction of a person's liberty to choose how to direct their life. On the other hand, advocates of laws against drugs argue that state paternalism is necessary to preserve your autonomy, because under the condition of addiction, you'd lose some of that. Now, people like Dworkin note that Mill himself argued that no one should be free to willingly enslave themselves, because that would be to forfeit their freedom. And so from Dworkin's viewpoint, Mill's claim is consistent with the idea that drug laws prevent us from willingly relinquishing our autonomy, that it prevents us from willingly giving up our ability to make free choices. And I'll read it here. It's from the editor's introduction to Dworkin. He says, so supporters of criminalization argue that paternalistic laws are necessary to prevent people from willingly giving up their autonomy, which is essentially what they do when they become addicted to drugs. Okay, so with this in mind, let's make more specific inroads into the Dworkin article. Dworkin describes paternalism in detail, and he gives an argument that at least certain paternalistic laws against drugs can be morally justified. He begins the paper by providing dueling quotes, one from Mill and one from someone named General Hershey, and they express different ideas about paternalism. Mill is quoted saying, neither one person nor any number of persons is justified in saying to another human being of mature age that he shall not do with his life for his own benefit what he chooses to do with it. So that's kind of like a clear statement of libertarian and anti-paternalist thought. But then General Hershey says, I do not want to go along with a volunteer basis. I think a fellow should be forced to become better and not let him use his own discretion whether he wants to get smarter, more healthy, or more honest. And so that would be like to the exact opposite extreme, somebody who believes in powerful forms of paternalism to guide and shape like human character and development. So after that, Dworkin mentions the simple principle from On Liberty that only harm to others justifies interference in freedom. And Dworkin says that this principle of Mill can actually be broken down into two sub-principles. So I'm going to put those here in the chat. So two principles of Mill's anti-paternalism. Number one, which I'm going to use the Arabic numeral lowercase I, prevention of harm to others is sometimes a good enough reason to exercise compulsion. Okay. Prevention of harm to others is sometimes a good enough reason to exercise compulsion. Compulsion in this context means imposing on something to do something that they may not freely choose, or preventing them from doing something that they might otherwise have freely chosen to do. So like interfering with their liberty, basically. And this first part of Mill's anti-paternalist principle is that when you're going to hurt other people, that might be a good enough reason for us to limit your freedom. You know, so if you're going to try to attack somebody, then obviously the state, in the form of like law and police, could prevent you from doing that because it's not okay. Or if you're going to steal something from another person, you're harming another person, and that's a good enough reason to prohibit your actions and to make them eligible for penalties. But the second part of the Mill anti-paternalist principle is this, that the individual's own well-being is never a good enough reason to exercise compulsion. So, two claims side by side. The first is that what makes it okay to interfere with a person's liberty of action is if they were going to do something or if they were engaged in doing something that was harmful to others. And the second part says to protect the individual's own well-being, there's not a good enough reason to enforce some kind of compulsion on them or to interfere with their freedom. Now, nobody would deny the first claim. You'd have to be way out, in the clouds to think that you have a right to interfere with people or that rather you have a right to harm others. No one would say that the state should stand back and let people hurt others. So the first one is kind of like universally accepted. So Dworkin focuses most of his discussion on the second claim, the negative claim, that it's never a good enough reason to interfere with liberty just to protect someone's own well-being. He then gives us a sort of baseline definition of paternalism. It's much like the one that we talked about in a few lectures prior. And just again, it is the idea that it's when we interfere with a person's liberty of action based on reasons that refer to their own best interests or well-being. He says looking at law is sometimes hard to find a pure case of paternalistic laws because they're often justified by many different factors. Take laws that don't allow us to smoke in certain public places. On the one hand, there's some aspect of that could be judged a little bit paternalistic because it's basically trying to impose on people that they not smoke for their own well-being. But these anti-public smoking laws, like say it when you're at school and it says like this is a smoke-free campus, so you can't vape or smoke cigarettes on the campus. Can you understand how that's not totally paternalistic? How it also has mixed together with it like a harm principle justification? Easy enough to say, but someone just, if you can hit me with that in the chat. How do you think that these particular laws, just using the anti-smoking as an example, are not entirely paternalistic because they're also mixed together with prevention of harm to others? Because what's this really trying to prevent? It's not just trying to prevent the person from themselves smoking and hurting themselves, but also what else? What harm can come to other people that this law is trying to stop people from doing? Go ahead. Don't just wait for anybody else. Let's see you give me a comment. Secondhand smoke causes harm to others. Exactly. Good. Thank you. It can make other people sick. So you're right. Here's a law that you might say, hey, don't tread on me, etc. I just want to smoke. It's my body. It's my life. But the anti-smoking laws that we're talking about in like public locations, they can be seen in both ways. They're also intending to prevent you from, with the secondhand smoke, harming other people. Another one could be like anti-drunk driving laws. Now, does it protect the person from themselves if they're prohibited from driving drunk? Yes, because they could get in an accident and cause self-harm. But obviously, that's not the only reason that we have these legal rules, because we also want to stop the drunk driver from potentially hurting other people other than themselves. So when you look at the idea of what laws are paternalistic in nature, he says it's kind of hard to find a pure case, but nonetheless, he does try to mention at least a few. So I'm looking at it on page 243 of the textbook, and he gives an interesting sort of list of different possible laws that could be arguably seen as paternalistic in nature. Laws requiring motorcyclists to wear safety helmets. That's one for sure, because that's not about anyone else's benefit or protection. It's just a one rider. Next, laws forbidding people from swimming at the beach when there's no lifeguard on duty. There's another one. I mean, if we allowed people to do that, they might drown because no one's there to rescue them in case they get carried away in like the waves. Now, of course, that's not entirely pure either, because I guess you could say that it might necessitate a rescue effort that could put someone else at risk, but it's primarily paternalistic. Laws making suicide a criminal offense. I mean, that's almost the clearest example you can think of something that just benefits the one person from their own self-harming behavior. Laws making it illegal for women and children to work at certain types of jobs, right? We have like these child labor laws, and some people might say, oh, well, what if the child wants to go into the workforce? Well, we think that that's such an important phase of like your early development that you shouldn't be put into those kind of hours or doing that type of labor. So we might impose on the freedom of the child in this case to make that decision. Laws regulating certain kinds of sexual conduct, like there used to be laws against private same-sex intercourse, and that's done among consenting adults. So there again, you would think it's some kind of like protection of moral virtue idea from an old-time worldview, but it would be paternalistic again. Laws regulating the use of certain drugs. And of course, that's the main topic, but he's applying this question of paternalism to all these cases. Laws requiring a license to engage in certain professions, with those not receiving a license subject to fine or jail sentence if they do engage in that practice. We'll come back to that in a moment, the idea of an unlicensed, for example, medical practitioner. There are laws that prohibit that, and the penalties would apply to the practitioner if they engaged in some, like say, medical trade or practice where they're not actually qualified by having a degree. Laws forbidding various forms of gambling. Laws regulating against dueling, another one that we talked about previously too. So just to give us those list of paternalistic laws, in addition to these laws which forbid action, there are also certain paternalistic laws that are intended to prevent you from being able to carry out your plans. For example, suppose that you're a member of a certain religious denomination that forbids blood transfusions. But if you find yourself in the emergency room in a critical scenario, then they may sometimes force you to get the blood transfusion that you have a religious objection to just because it's for your own best interests. Or institutionalizing a person that's becoming a harm to themselves. This is the so-called, what do they call it, 550 or something like that. There's like a way in which a person can be institutionalized against their will if it can be shown by the courts or whatever that they're a potential harm to themselves. Now, consideration of some of these examples requires a slight addition to the basic definition of paternalism that was given prior. In some of these examples, the people whose benefit is of concern is not identical to the class of people whose freedom is being limited or curtailed. So he gives us the difference between pure and impure paternalism. This is the next, the 72-hour hold, the 5150. Good, you remembered the phrase or reference. Thanks for that, Michelle. He distinguishes at this point between two different subcategories of paternalism, pure versus impure paternalism. So let me go ahead and tell you what the difference is between those by putting it in the chat. Pure paternalism is when the class of individuals whose liberty is restricted is the same identical class of individuals who we want to benefit through the restriction. So So that would be pure paternalism. And I'll give the definitions and then we'll explain it in more detail by some examples. But let me get the other definition too, impure paternalism. So impure paternalism, the only difference from the other definition is just that the class of individuals whose liberty is being restricted by the proposed policy or whatever is not identical to the class of individuals who we intend to benefit with the restriction. So okay, so you see pure paternalism and impure paternalism. The only difference between the two is whether or not the people who are being restricted are the same people that we hope will benefit with or by the restriction. So let me give you a case of pure paternalism first, because it's a little easier to understand. If we have a law that says you can't ride a motorcycle without a helmet, without fear of legal sanctions or being ticketed, right? Who are the people who are restricted? Whose liberty is restricted by that exact law? Like who's prevented from doing what they want to do? It's easy to say, but I'm giving the motorcycle helmet law as this example. So with the motorcycle helmet law, who is restricted exactly? It's the people that what? Like whose liberty is being infringed in some minor way? It's obviously the people that what? We're placing restrictions on who in that case? The people that don't want to wear it, exactly, the helmetless riders or the would-be helmetless riders. Now, in that same example, whose well-being are we trying to protect or benefit with those restrictions? And if you consider what pure paternalism means, or just think about it in common sense terms, you'll be able to say, we're restricting people that want to ride without a helmet, and we're doing that for the sake of who? For whose benefit? Those same people, exactly, Marina. It's not like we're trying to protect other people by imposing this restriction on them. It's not like when you don't have a helmet on, you become more lethal in case you run into some person. It's like it has no bearing on anyone else's well-being. It's the well-being of the people that would ride without the helmet that we're trying to protect and preserve. So that's pure paternalism. But next, let's take the unlicensed practitioner example. So suppose that there's a person who is going to perform some kind of medical procedure for people. And that person is not actually licensed to do that. It could be like, say, an example of dental work that a person who's like a black market dentist is going to give. This person's not actually got any kind of recognition or formal training, let's suppose, but they'll provide the service. And suppose that there are some people that would willingly pay them for the service. Why would they do that? Maybe because they think that they'll save money on it. It's not totally out of the question. This definitely has and can happen. I've heard of people who would, let's say, cross the border to get like black market dental work because they thought it was too expensive or that their health insurance wouldn't cover it here in the United States. Then they would maybe be getting a service provided to them by a person who maybe has some real life experience doing the procedure, but does not have the accreditation from like a reputable institute or any at all. Now, in that case, suppose that there's this unlicensed practitioner of some form of medicine, and there's a willing customer, knowing full well that they're not licensed, but wanting to get a break on price. This is illegal, at least in our state and in our country, and in many others, obviously. But if that is discovered and the law finds out, who's going to be penalized? Who's going to be penalized? Who would face penalties? Would it be the unlicensed practitioner or the would-be patient? Like, who stands to be punished if this interaction or transaction came to light by, let's say, authorities? Let me know. The practitioner, correct. So it's the practitioner that would like face fines, maybe jail time, and so forth, sanctions under the law. But when we do that, who are we trying to protect? We punish the practitioner for the sake of the practitioner? No. We're trying to, by means of this law, protect the well-being of what individuals? The well-being of the people that would request the service. Yes. So notice that in this case, the class of people whose liberty is being restricted, like they're not being allowed to perform the service, or they face penalties if they do, is the unlicensed individual. But the person who we're trying to benefit by means of those restrictions are not those unlicensed practitioners, but rather their would-be patients. So this is a case where it's not pure paternalism because, again, who we're trying to protect is not the same as who's going to be punished or penalized. Now, you might wonder, well, how is that different from just laws that prevent me from, attacking my neighbor by assault and battery? In that case, that person is going to be held accountable legally for my protection. But that's not paternalistic because it's the harm principle, right? But this is actually different from the case of the unlicensed practitioner, because with the unlicensed practitioner, we have a willing participant in the transaction. So there's still some like reprimand of a person's otherwise voluntary decision making, so it's not, you can't assimilate it to simple cases of just like the harm principle. It's trying to prevent a consensual transaction for the benefit of one member in the transaction by applying potential penalties to the other party to the transaction. Another example that's used in the book to illustrate impure paternalism would be a case like this. So suppose that there's a factory in a certain city or town, and this factory, one consequence of what it's doing is that it's emitting a lot of pollutants into the air or water. So that's not so good for the people that live nearby the factory. And if it, let's say, exceeds certain limits of like emissions, then maybe the government could impose financial penalties or whatever on that company. Now, who faces the penalties if they exceed those limits? The company would. But it's not for the benefit of the company that we do this. It's for the benefit of who? The community. It's for the benefit of the members of the community that would be negatively affected by the excessive pollution. But this can be seen as another case of impure paternalism, because you can imagine a community that actually would be willing to bear these negative environmental consequences, as long as the company was handing out jobs to people, right? So there might be some people in that community that say, hey, let's not cap their emissions or pollutants, because that might mean that they have less revenue to give out to new people that they want to employ. But notice that here again, we impose a restriction on the company for the benefit of the members of the society surrounding it, even if those members of the community surrounding it would prefer that it was allowed to pollute with no limits. So anyway, we then have that like interesting and subtle addition to our general definition of paternalism, that it can come in these two different varieties or flavors, the impure versus the pure. He also gives another distinction, another form of paternalistic interference that could be sometimes confused with the harm principle, or that might not be necessarily even considered to be paternalistic. Consider, for example, labor laws that don't allow people to work more than 40 hours per week without receiving overtime pay, right? So like the 40-hour work week, if you exceed that number of work hours, the law says that the company has to pay you an additional wage at a higher rate. Now, is that paternalistic? You can imagine why one might think so, because there could be certain employees or certain workers that would rather that there not be such mandated overtime hour pay, because maybe they think that means that they won't be given the opportunity to work in hours of excess of 40 hours. Right? So you can imagine some very industrious person who says, oh, I wish the 40-hour work week didn't exist, because the company knows they're going to have to pay me overtime if they go beyond that, so they're not going to be willing to give me more hours than 40. And I would rather not even get overtime pay as long as I could work 60 hours a week, But here again, the author actually doesn't agree that this is paternalistic. He doesn't think that this is an instance of true paternalism, because the reason that these labor laws exist is because it is the unionized workforce that wants to have some kind of restrictions on the number of hours that the management can give to them. So it's actually not recognized as an interference in the liberty of the workforce considered as a whole. Even though there may be some like outliers within that workforce that would rather that these laws not exist, it's still something that is in line with the general expressed will and intention of the collective bargaining units that are, the unions. So he says that even though there could be like an occasional individual that would rather side with the idea that they don't like these laws, that they're imposing on the company's freedom to just give me more hours than 40, he says this is still something that's done at the collective level of bargaining. And therefore, the workforce considered as a unit, as a whole, does in fact want these limitations to exist for the benefit of them so that the management side of things can't just make them work excessively. So, as Mill says, such laws are required not to overrule the judgment of individuals respecting their own interests, but to give effect to that judgment at a collective level. So he doesn't want you to think that like these like 40-hour work week labor laws are another instance of paternalism, because again, true paternalism is when we interfere with the liberty of people for their own benefit. And even though there may be an individual worker that feels like their freedom to work beyond 40 hours with no overtime is being denied to them, when you consider them as a member of the overall unionized workforce, it's still something that doesn't stand against the will of the workforce considered at the union level. So in that case, compulsion is not used to achieve a benefit that's not recognized as a benefit by those that are being interfered with. And in fact, there's no other way to negotiate such outcomes except at the level of collective bargaining, because you can't have like one employee that goes to management and says, I will not work for you if you assign me more than 40 hours a week without overtime, because that's just one individual. There have to be like the threat of like industry-wide strikes and things, so there have to be collective bargaining units. Okay, so finally we get to the most important part of this paper, which is what could be the justification for paternalistic laws. And he starts this section by again looking at Mill's argument against paternalism, which is written on our page 245. And when I'm reading it, it says here, so it's a full-on argument with like 4 premises and then 1 conclusion at the bottom. I'm just going to read them, and I'm going to focus on the 4th premise when we get to it, because that's the one that he singles out for the most attention. But here's what the overall argument of Mill is, as stated by Dworkin. Premise 1, since restraint is an evil, the burden of proof is on those who propose a restraint. So generally, freedom is good, and being restrained is generally bad. So anytime we propose a restraint, there's a high burden of proof on the person who proposes it. Second premise, since the conduct which is being considered is purely self-regarding, the normal appeal to protecting the interests of other people is not available. So if it's purely self-regarding conduct, then you can't say that the justification for the restraint is to protect other people. So he says, in that case, the appeal to protecting the interests of others is not available. Third premise, therefore, we have to consider whether reasons involving reference to the individual's own well-being, happiness, welfare, or interests are enough to overcome the burden of justification. So if it's a paternalistic law that restrains people's liberty, we have to give some good reason for why the restraint is desirable. And if we can't point to a harm to others, we have to point towards some reasons involving reference to the individual's own well-being. And now we have the critical 4th premise, which says we either cannot advance the interests of an individual by force, or the attempt to do so will create more evil, which will outweigh whatever benefit. And so the conclusion, therefore, is that therefore the promotion of the individual's own best interest is not a good enough reason to use compulsion. Now, why do you think, perhaps, Mill would say that we cannot impose well-being on a person by force? He bolsters that idea by appeal to the claim that each person is best suited to judge their own interests. So let me put that in the chat. So Mill says that we cannot advance a person's well-being by force against their will, like imposing on them the good which they themselves don't want. And the reason is because, he claims, each person is best suited to judge their own self-interest. And I want us to linger on this point for a moment because it's kind of interesting and philosophically rich. What he's saying is that you really can't promote a person's well-being against their will, because that would mean that you think you know better than they do what's good for them. And arguably, each individual is the best judge of their own self-interest. Why do you think a person might be considered the best judge of their own self-interest? Well, perhaps it's obvious, because who else can have a greater interest in your well-being than you? I mean, even when you have close people that are attached to you, the interest that they can take in your well-being pales in comparison to your own self-interest. Now, you might see a person who's like living an unhealthy lifestyle, eating a lot of bad food, not working out, et cetera, et cetera. And you might try to think, well, I should probably prevent them from doing those things. But if you ask the person themselves, they would probably tell you, well, you know what? I just have different priorities than you. My perspective is that I would rather have a shorter life as long as I could enjoy all this food, and et cetera. So you might argue that whenever you try to invalidate someone's own personal decision about what their self-interest is, you're bound to get it wrong, because if that person thought that that was in their self-interest, then they already would have done it. And here's how Mill himself describes that, reading from the book. So, with respect to his own feelings and circumstances, the most ordinary man or woman has means of knowledge that far surpass those that can be possessed by anyone else. He is the man most interested in his own well-being. The interest which any other person, except in cases of strong personal attachment, can have in it is trifling compared to that which he himself has. So, Mill then continues and says, the interference of society to overrule his judgment and purposes in what only regards himself must be grounded in general assumptions which may be altogether wrong, and even if right, are as likely as not to be misapplied to the individual case. The strongest of all arguments against the interference of the public with purely personal conduct is that when it does interfere, the odds are that it interferes wrong and in the wrong place. All errors which the individual is likely to commit against advice and warning are far outweighed by the evil of allowing others to control him to do what they deem to be his good. So a bit of an awkward quote, but he says, mankind are greater gainers, meaning we gain more by suffering or allowing each person to live as seems good to themselves than by trying to force each other to live as seems good to the rest. Now, Mill himself believes this to be the general presumption, with a few important exceptions. So now we get to the exceptions that even Mill was willing to consider. Mill did say that any departure from the general presumption that we should allow people to run their own lives without external control can be overcome only by reference to some great evil or negative factor. So for Mill, paternalism is not categorically wrong, it's only presumptively wrong. There's just a very high burden of proof that has to be met in order to justify an interference in personal liberty. And he does say that we could not permissibly sell ourselves to slavery, because that would destroy our ability to have future freedom after that. So according to Dworkin, then, we can formulate a narrow principle by which to justify some paternalistic interference. So now we get to the claims of Dworkin about how even Mill would license certain kinds of justifiable paternalism. So and he gives three bases or grounds of justified paternalistic interference. Okay, so the first of three, it's taken sort of in line with Mill's claim that you shouldn't be allowed to become a slave. So one of them is if the interference is necessary to preserve or protect your future autonomy, or a more wide range of autonomy in the future. So one case where he thinks even Mill would have to concede that an interference in your liberty is morally justified is if we were doing it to protect and preserve your future autonomy. Okay, so like the case of willingly becoming a slave is one. You might be wondering, who would ever want to be a slave? But there could have been, at least in the time of slavery, some people that would be like, okay, well, as long as I can have some degree of like protection and security, like on a person's property, I'd be willing to choose slavery. But Mill was a strong opponent of slavery across the board, even during the time of his life when it still existed in America for part of his life. So anyway, imagine that a person wanted to do that, then they would give up and forfeit their freedom. And so Mill said, no, that's not okay. Even though he was strongly opposed to paternalism, he thought that we should not allow people to do things that would permanently or in most likelihood destroy their freedom going forward afterwards. So anti-drug laws, some people might argue, are in line with that. A justified case of prohibition against your liberty, but in order to preserve that same liberty in the broader range of time in the future. Another example of that might be the interference that we apply to children. So little children, we don't tell them, do you want to go to school? It's just up to you. Because if we gave them the autonomy to make those decisions, then they would reach adulthood being totally deprived of their freedom because they wouldn't have like reading skills, reasoning skills, mathematical skills, and that would make it such that they were not capable of making a whole range of more wise, informed, mature adult decisions. So you could argue that this is another case that Mill would also concede the point. He would say, okay, well, interfering in the liberty of children is okay because, we want to make sure that they develop into the fully rational and autonomous adults down the line. And if they were given just carte blanche to do whatever they wanted with no limitations on their freedom, then they would never get to actually attain their full measure of autonomy and freedom. Does that make sense to you guys? Hopefully so. So if you can say anything in the chat to confirm, it'll be helpful. But I think it makes sense in general. So the prohibition against interference doesn't apply to like restrictions imposed on children, like to eat healthy, to go to school, to go to bed at a certain time. Because they lack the emotional and cognitive capacity to make fully rational decisions. So they lack an adequate conception of their own present and future interests. They have a hard time deferring gratification into the future. And because of this, they would be endangered without the parent restricting their freedom and society restricting their freedom in certain ways. But note that even here, the exercise of parental power is limited to those interferences that the child would eventually come to endorse. You might be able to relate to that. You can probably go back in your memory to your childhood days and remember those days where your parents are waking you up and they're like, okay, off to school. And you're like, I don't want to go to school. And you kind of protest and you complain. But then you become an adult like you are now. And you may even go back to your parents and say, you know what, I want to just say thank you for putting up with me when I was a child and bearing with me as I complained about all the necessary actions that you put me through. Because at that point in time, I was not fully mature. But now that I am, I recognize that it was necessary. So he says that another case where the justification for the paternalistic interference would be particularly strong is if we think that the person would eventually come to thank you for the interference when they were fully rational and mature. So here's the second case. If the interference is one that they would thank you for later in the future. That's kind of like a delayed consent to the interference. It's not there in the present, but it's future consent, as it were. So if the interference is one that the person would come to thank you for later when they are fully rational. And speaking to this second case of justified paternalistic interference, so one case, if it's needed to protect your future autonomy. A second and related case, if it's the type of interference that we think the person themselves would authorize with their own rational will at some future time. In that case, it's like we're not actually standing against your mature rational will. We're only standing against the immature version of it or the temporarily impaired version of it. Let me give you another case. Suppose that there was someone really drunk and they want to drive. They want to get behind the wheel and drive off. And you're like their friend and you have their keys. So they're like, give me my keys. That doesn't belong to you. That's my car. Don't tell me what to do. You're not my parent, blah, blah, blah. But you're like saying, no, I'm not going to return them back to you. In this case, we might say it's like an instance of the second justification for paternalism because why? Because even though they're saying that now, you imagine that if they were to sober up later, right, that at that future point in time, they would come back and be like, you know what, thanks for keeping the keys away from me. I was going to do something really foolish. Or another case, someone's in a highly emotional state where they're not thinking rationally. And they're like, you know what, I'm going to make a phone call to my ex and tell him what I think. And you're like, well, I'm not going to give you your phone because you think that right now they're like in this emotional state that doesn't express their full, fully considered rational autonomous will. So you might say that I'm interfering with the liberty of your action at the moment, but it's something that you're going to vindicate later. Because when you are no longer in the state of temporary impairment, for whatever reason it may be, drugs, emotions, sleep deprivation, etc., then you'll be willing to grant that they did the right thing. So even maybe Mill, according to Dworkin, would be okay with these, limited instances of paternalistic interference. Let's see what else I have on that. So he says, yeah, these are cases in which even a general opponent of paternalism might be willing to grant that this is okay and reasonable. Another sort of case where the justified interference is seen, and it's not even hypothetical in nature, is the case of prior consent. So let me talk about that third case. If permission to interfere in their liberty was granted in the past by that person. So we have three cases. We have needed to protect your autonomy, the kind of interference that you would eventually come to endorse when you were more, let's say, rational, mature, etc. And a third case, if the interference is one that you actually did already give permission to in the past. Even if now you're expressing a contrary view, having said so before makes it okay for us to interfere with you based on that prior consent. So there's like expected future consent and actual prior consent. This last example can be illustrated by something that he mentions, the case of Odysseus and the sirens. Now, I don't know how many of you guys know about like the classic works of Homer and the Odyssey, but there is this episode in that old classic piece of fiction. It's like an epic poem or story. Marina, you say, Professor, do you believe that this logic justifies broader restrictions on harmful but legal behaviors like gambling or extreme sports? Well, in the end, the author is going to qualify it a little bit. He's going to say that the most reasonable restrictions are those that are not going to strike against the person's feeling of self-identity. So like extreme sports, he's going to try to probably like cordon that off by saying that that is so deeply wound up with a person's sense of personal identity and their character and personality that that's something that ought not be deprived from them. But I do think that that's also a kind of problematic claim he makes, because he wants to say that drug using is something that's not core to a person's identity. And so because it might destroy your autonomy if you became addicted, and maybe for that type of reason, it's something that falls within the scope of justified paternalism. But I find it hard to draw a line, because some people are like, oh yeah, like drugs are my thing. Like I love drugs. I believe in the drug counterculture. So for some people, it might be hard to disentangle their sense of personality and character from their recreational drug using habits. But Dworkin tries to use that as the dividing line. He's like, well, if this is something that's core to your identity, like you're a rock climber, you can't be deprived of that risky activity without changing something fundamental about your personality or character. But he seems to think that drug using recreationally doesn't amount to something that is deeply embedded in like your character and personality. But that's something that we might be having some skepticism about. But yeah, I mean, just according to the argument that he states, it's hard for him, I think, to justifiably exclude those things. And you do say the same, that it's hard to draw the line. Yeah, it seems there's always an exception. That's true. I was just going to make this little quick point about the whole Odysseus thing, but to be fair, we're getting a little low on time. So there's really not much left. I mean, we've pretty much run through all of his article. In the end, what he's saying here is that even if you hold the standard of Mill, that we should not accept paternalism, except in like the extreme circumstances where it might lead to your, self-enslavement, or in other related cases where we need to impose it on you because you're not fully rational at the moment, or that maybe you gave consent in the past. He thinks that those exceptions to the general stance against paternalism could still encompass the anti-drug laws. So what he's trying to do is make a limited argument for some justified paternalism that could include such things as laws that stand in your way of like making a free decision to perhaps become addicted to something, which he's kind of trying to equate with the decision to enslave yourself. I'm not sure if Mill would have really accepted the equivocation between choosing to do drugs recreationally and literally choosing to be a slave, because the historical context makes clear that he was really talking about real slavery. But nonetheless, Dworkin, he kind of takes that point and runs with it, and he tries to make a new argument by basically saying that, if even Mill would be okay with some limited forms of paternalism, then we shouldn't complain that, paternalism is sometimes justified. You could be a really hardcore libertarian, and like Mill is, and still find some basic reasons to support at least limited encroachments into personal liberty. But yeah, I want to finish with this Odysseus and the sirens example. We'll do that on Tuesday when we come back after the weekend. But on Tuesday also, we're transitioning to another new topic, which is going to be, it's a mini topic, just 2 lectures on it, but genetic engineering and human cloning. So anyway, guys, I see that you're heading out, Anthony, and to all the others, I understand we're getting to the end of our time. So let's just close the live for now. Anybody that wants to say goodbye or signing out, that'd be great. But anyways, not to worry. Those that haven't yet sent me their essays, just don't forget they're due today by the end of the day. And I'll be sending back a confirmation email to those so that they make sure that they know I've received it. Okay, everybody, thanks so much again, and another good meeting, and have a good one. I'll see you guys. Talk to you soon. Okay, bye. What's my favorite Odyssey? Mario Odyssey. From, you know what I'm saying? Like the old, what was it, GameCube? All right. Or no, is that the Switch? Yeah. Okay, have a good one, guys. Thanks.